So in the previous video, we talked about how to work with PMs and EMs, and how to define the scope of the project, how to set timeline, milestones, and so on, right? And hopefully you have figured out what engineers to staff. But let's go a little bit deeper into how to figure out the staffing and how to set the team up in a way that they can execute and you all can succeed. So the first part of this is figuring out the tasks a little bit, and essentially that's like taking a big problem and breaking it into smaller chunks. You might want to consider a few things: that how independently can two sub-problems be solved, right? Are they tightly coupled? Can you develop both pieces independently and then integrate it towards the end of the timeline? The other aspect is, do you have strong enough leads that can own those sub-problems independently? And if not, you have to take some of this on yourself, right? But it's still important to go through this exercise of figuring out how to divide up the problem into smaller parts. The other is defining the operating structure of the team. And by that, I mean you need to rely on other senior engineers or other leads to run with a problem, right? Say the project that I'm leading is big enough to have 15 engineers on it. I certainly cannot be interfacing with 15 engineers directly. What I want is 3 or 4 TLs that get assigned another layer of engineers. They have clear, like swim lanes where they're operating without stepping on each other's toes. And as a TL, as an Uber TL, what I do is I work with these leads on a weekly basis to figure out what they're up to, dividing up work, and so on. And the other thing is, like, it's almost like a scaling problem where I am, scaling myself as a TL. So depending on the team size, you might or might not have to do it. But, if you're leading a smaller team, it's more or less like, hey, there's 4 engineers. Yeah, I'm going to work with each of them directly. I'll meet with them weekly. We'll do stand-ups, stuff like that. So one other aspect which I haven't mentioned in the slides here is figuring out who's good at what, right? And what is the situation of each of the individuals that you are trying to rely on. Some people want to get promoted. Some people want good work-life balance. And some people are driven by novelty of the work they do. If you mismatch the type of work with the type of person, you end up with a disastrous situation where neither the work gets done and nor the team is happy. So that requires a lot of empathetic work, having that type of emotional intelligence to figure out what is the personal driver of the individuals on your team. And that might help you figure out the right scope for them and also vouch for them with their managers when they do great work. So keep an eye out for that when you are assigning tasks to the team. On this note, let's talk about delegation. Everybody wants to build cool stuff, right? But that's the neat part for TLs. You don't. And most TLs make this mistake of not trusting their team enough. So delegation is an exercise in trust. It begins with taking a risk. There's an inherent risk to delegation that the quality of work might be bad, or maybe the work wouldn't even happen, right? So trust is built in layers, and we'll talk more about it later, but you have to take the risk. If you can't trust your team, there's something amiss to begin with. And there's layers of delegation. I won't get into it super deep, but simply the 3 layers are: one is when you give a task to somebody and you verify and you keep an eye on it, like close eye, to ensure that if they are off track, you can put them back on track or give them more assistance than needed. You do this 5 times. 6th time you don't have to do it. 6th time you just give someone a task, they can just run with it. The third layer, the ultimate layer of delegation, is you just specify the problem, right? Like you don't tell a solution, you don't keep track of it, and you totally trust somebody to do it. So as a TL, you may exercise it in different ways, different layers of it. But one thing I always say is that when you're delegating something to someone, do keep in mind that you don't want to give them something you wouldn't do yourself. That's a critical piece. One other thing is that if you want to be that multiplying force as a tech lead, you can pick up tasks for yourself that are not shiny, that are not, fun. Nobody wants to do grungy work, but sometimes it's necessary. And I think that's a leader that leads by example, by doing work that nobody else wants to, and then is also the hardest to do. So personally, I take on tasks that team doesn't have bandwidth to do, but really set us up for success in the long term. And one example is that we were building some type of orchestration management system back in the day, and my original vision was that all of it could be just config driven, state machines, and these state machines could be configured with a very simple JSON type of language, JSON type of structure. But to de-risk the timeline, one thing we did was that, hey, let's start building this stuff in code first. Let's just hard code everything. We can always move it to configs later. And I knew that was an okay thing to do to de-risk the timeline. So I did not ask, my junior engineers and senior engineers to build it that way. But I started looking at it and I saw that the amount of state machines, the number of state machines that we were going to configure in next 5 months or 6 months was going to be 20. And with every hard coding of the state machine in the code, we were spending an extra, a week or so that we could have simply slashed off. So I stayed up I spent one whole weekend, and it was so much fun to actually define the schema and the structure of this imperative language for configurations. And I migrated the one or two state machines that we already had checked in our code base, and the look on the faces of and the look on everybody's face when I go into the stand-up on Monday with my code changes ready, it was priceless. Everybody's like, oh my God, Lalit, you are crazy. And it felt good. It felt validating as a leader that, hey, I still got it, guys. I'm here to do whatever we need to succeed. Thing is that in those 6 months, we were so happy that I did that because it became so easy to configure those state machines. We saved so much productivity. And, it was also just an overall reliable solution in general. So point being, delegation, do delegate. Don't keep all the shiny stuff to yourself. And the philosophy that I live by is that, you are a servant to the team. So you are serving them, and you wouldn't ever ask them to do something that you wouldn't do yourself.